Hi there, I'm Troy Deutmeyer, and I am a field agronomist with Pioneer here in Northeast Iowa. And just to kind of tell you what a field agronomist does is I essentially help our sales reps go out to farmers' locations when maybe they have a problem or issue with one of their crops. And so kind of think of it as a corn and soybean alfalfa doctor, really. And so if there's something wrong with the crop that we can do to try to help fix it, maybe some crop protection products, or maybe give it a little more fertilizer, which is like nutrients, which is like the food that we eat. A lot of times that can help fix the crop. So some of the questions I guess that we wanted to cover today is, when does a farmer know when it's time to start planting their crop? And a lot of times in the spring, kind of what we're looking for is when the soil temperatures get to be around, like, say 45 to 50 degrees. That's usually a pretty good time that we can start planting our corn and our soybeans. Now, our alfalfa that is used in, like, say, dairy production, a lot of times we can start seeding that when the soil temperatures are even in the 30s. So essentially, as soon as the soil gets fit and it's not muddy, we can go ahead and we can start planting that crop. All right, so what does a farmer have to do to get their fields ready to plant? A lot of times we start off with taking soil samples in the fall or maybe the previous year. And what a soil sample is we're taking little probes in the soil and collecting a sample of soil. We send it into the lab and we get like a nutrient analysis back. It's kind of like when your parents go to the doctor and maybe they have a blood test done and it's telling them like what their cholesterol is and things like that. Essentially, we're running a report like that for our soil, so we can tell if we have to add some lime or some other types of fertilizer to help make the crops grow. So then after we get the soil test back, if we need to apply any fertilizer, things like that, we go ahead and get that applied. And then a lot of times guys will do what they call tillage. So if any of you have parents that have gardens, maybe a lot of times they'll run a tiller to stir the soil up and kind of loosen things up and dry things out. That's kind of the same thing that farmers do with tillage, just to kind of get things ready to go for the planter. Now, some people also do no-till, where they don't do any tillage, and then a planter like this just comes through and puts the seed in the ground. So those are kind of really the only two things that farmers need to do to go ahead and get their fields ready for planting. But the big thing that you always have to keep in mind is to make sure that the soil is not too wet. And if it's too wet, essentially what will happen is we will compact the soil down, and when it dries out, it'll kind of turn into a brick, and then therefore the crops can't emerge, come up through the soil very well from the seed, or a lot of times the rain can't penetrate down into the soil. All right, so the next thing that we'll cover is, when do farmers purchase their seed and what's kind of the difference? So a lot of times farmers will purchase their seed shortly after harvest. And the reason why they do that is they just got done harvesting the crop and they know which varieties or hybrids perform the best. And how you could think of a variety or hybrid is, like there's different types of vehicles. Your dad might like a Chevy truck, and some dads might like Ford trucks, or some moms might like their Toyota minivan versus a Subaru. And so essentially there's different kinds of seed, and what farmers do is they figure out which seed works best on their own farms. And so then right when they get finished with harvest, they know what performed well, what yielded really well, how many bushels per acre that they got from, say, a particular corn hybrid or soybean variety. And so being they just figured out that information, they're like, hey, this one did really well. I want that one again for next year, or maybe this one didn't do so well. So that's kind of how they figure out which ones to order, and their people that they buy it from also have a pretty good idea how the products are performing. So that's kind of when they do it, and kind of the differences between the seed. So how does a farmer ensure that they have a good harvest and produce a good crop? Well, some of it's kind of what we already talked about. You have to make sure you have good soil tests and make sure that you have adequate fertilizer and nutrition there. It's just like we need good nutrition, so do our crops, and that's a very important part. One of the big things, though, is to get your crop off to a good start, to make sure that you have a good finish, is we need to make sure that we plant it into ideal conditions. We talked earlier about making sure that the soil was in that 45 to 50 degree range and things weren't too wet that we caused compaction. Then as the season goes on and the crop comes up, what we need to be doing is out there looking at our crop every once in a while to make sure that there aren't things like bugs chewing it up or a whole bunch of weeds coming in that might choke it out. So it's kind of the same thing that your parents are doing with their garden, right? Maybe your parents send you out to the garden to pull the weeds. Well, the reason why they're doing that is because those weeds are competing for the food and the water and the sunlight that Mother Nature gives us to grow our food. So it's kind of the same thing. So once we get through the growing season, then it's really important that the farmers harvest their crop timely, because what happens is after those corn and soybean plants die, they kind of start to deteriorate, and if you get a bunch of wind and rain or snow, that could cause the crop to fall over and not be harvestable. So making sure that you get in there on time and getting the crop out is really also a big component to make sure that what we took the time and effort for earlier in the season to produce, we make sure that it gets into the grain bin. All right, so how does the whole planting process work? And we'll kind of go take it from seed and put it into the soil. So essentially what we do is we fill the big gray tanks right up there with our seed. And then as we start planting, the seed is actually blown from the tank through these tubes right here to the individual row units. Then there's a meter that spins inside here that picks out every individual little seed and puts it down a tube. There's some discs right in here that actually open a slot. So if you ever helped your parents plant corn or something like that in your garden, you probably take a hoe and go down the road to open up what we call a furrow. That's what these things do. The meter drops the seed down in to the bottom of the trench, and then these wheels push the soil back together. So there's soil over top of the seed, and then you have this tire right here, firms it down. Now, some people also have planters that have maybe like a tank or a fertilizer component to it, and essentially that's what this is right here. The fertilizer comes out, and we put it right there on top of the ground, right next to the seed, and then you just hope that Mother Nature treats you good, and the corn and soybeans come up, and you're off to the races. So I guess a couple of the monitors that I have in the cab here, this one here is actually controlling my auto steer, so you can see my passes. And this allows the tractor to kind of steer itself, and you can plant nice straight lines or stay on the contour, reduce overlap, kind of be more efficient with your planting pass. And then this monitor right here is controlling the actual planter. So what's going on right now is it's putting on the correct seed, dropping the correct amount of seeds per acre, and it's also making sure that the row units stay in the ground at the proper depth, and it does that by adjusting the hydraulic down pressure, so that way all the seeds drop at the exact same depth, which helps them come up at the exact same time. So a lot of different buttons there, but overall it's not too terribly hard to run, and it kind of keeps me running right down the center of the rows, and I don't have to steer, and can kind of keep track of what's going on, I guess, when I